The Fujifilm X-T5 camera has a brand new firmware update available, and in today's video, we'll see if it improves the autofocus. Hi everyone, welcome to Autodetect. Last week, Fujifilm released their brand new XS20 camera, which brought with it a number of major improvements to autofocus and subject detection. I've got a whole video on that camera, as well as another video on all of the firmware updates that were released last week. Now, for the X-T5 and the X-H2 specifically, Fujifilm has added enhanced subject detection. The idea was for this firmware update to bring over some of the enhanced autofocus features that were launched with the XS20 camera over to the X-T5 and the X-H2 as well. What I decided to do was to shoot several tests, both indoors and out, to see if this camera's autofocus performs any better with the new firmware update. Now, before I show you my results, I need to go over a few things. First, this video is not sponsored from Fujifilm. Fujifilm has had zero input into it. In fact, they didn't even know I've made it. Secondly, my testing, my tests are anything but scientific. My main problem is that I only have one X-T5 camera, meaning that I had to set up all the shots and the tests, shoot them, and then go back, update the camera with the firmware, and then go back and try and shoot the same shots as closely as I did before the firmware update. I decided to use the 18 to 55 millimeter zoom lens. I wanted to use an inexpensive, well, reasonably inexpensive lens from Fuji, an older lens that I think a number of people either have or would have access to. And lastly, what I wanted to say regarding testing is that I am sorry I did not include Piper in this round of testing for autofocus on dogs. She's sort of a tradition on this channel, and she's been in many videos that I've made. To be honest with you, Piper is now 13 years old, and I just didn't feel right having her racing back and forth and up and down out in the hot sun doing these tests. So she sat out on this one, but she is doing great. So instead, for the erratic, moving around face-eye detection testing, I used my teenage kids. Let's get into it. Okay, so here we are before the firmware update, shooting with the X-T5 on face-eye Autodetect continuous autofocus with the 18 to 55 millimeter lens. And as you can see here, the face-eye Autodetect is sort of following the subject. Do you see that right there? And it does a fairly good job. Even when one subject crosses the other, you see how it switched like that? Look at that, boom. But there were definitely places that it missed. And here's something I want to point out that I mentioned in my complete review of the X-T5 camera. There were times when you would see a green square. You see that right there, which indicated the subject was in focus. However, I took it back into Lightroom or Capture One, and the shot was blurry. Remember, this is before the firmware update. And it still kind of just has a little trouble following. There you go. Or you'll have situations where they'll be on one side of the frame and they're both out of focus. Now let's take a look at the same scene after the firmware update. So here we have them right in the center, and as he starts to move to the right, we're still in focus. He's all the way over, we're still in focus. Still in focus, he's moving again, still in focus, and still in focus. Have a look at that. Again, coming back. And it missed one just toward the end when the buffer started filling up. Let's now check out autofocus with the subject moving toward the camera. Here we are before the firmware update, and we are running toward the camera. And we definitely have some misses. You see that? Look at that. Miss, 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 miss. There we go. And as they get to a certain point, it does start to connect. By the way, a number of these images were shot at ISO 2000 or even 2500, as I didn't want to get out in the sun and then come back later on and lose the sun. So I pretty much tried to shoot these only in the shade. So now let's check out the same situation, but after the firmware update. Okay, same thing. They're way back here running toward us. I'm zoomed in at 100%, but if I zoom in at 200%, you can see obviously this is high ISO here at 2500. But keep in mind that high ISO doesn't mean that it's out of focus. Remember, we're zoomed in at 200 here. Let's go back to 100. and it's tracking them, and as they come closer, they are still in focus, and the two of them were running very quickly. So for my next test, I went to try and shoot birds and Canadian geese to, test out the animal or bird-like subject auto detect. The problem that I ran into, and it was a big one, was that after I updated the firmware on the camera and I went back to that same scene, I tried to tell them to repeat exactly the same positions and movements that, they did the first time around before the firmware update, and they just wouldn't listen. But one thing I noticed was that before the firmware update, the camera seemed to autofocus on the subject in the background. It did that about half the time. Have a look right here. It's doing it right here. It did it right here where it focused on this subject and not this one. Even though I had the touch screen set to autofocus and I touched on the Canadian geese, the bird, the animal in the foreground, sometimes the camera ignored that and focused on the one in the background, particularly if it was brighter or had more contrast. However, after the update, as you can see right here, it did a great job in focusing on the subject that I told the camera to focus on, and it did not get fooled as much by any animal or bird that was in the background. And then for the heck of it, I decided to just go straight at the subject and continue shooting. And at first the camera got a little confused and then bam, got it, nailed it. My subject got a little agitated here. But look at that. Look at how many shots came out. Have a look at this. So then I put it on automotive subject detection to see if there was a difference. And I gotta tell you, with this firmware update, I was incredibly impressed by how well it captured every single car that it saw and recognized. Every shot came out, literally every shot. So for my last test, I wanted to try something that hadn't come to the X-T5 before, and that is insect detection. Now here's something that's caused confusion for people, both on the XS20 and on the X-T5. When you have the update applied and it says that it now supports insect and drone detection, you don't see those listed in the menu. According to Fujifilm, if you want to put the camera in insect detection, you need to put your menu on bird. That'll automatically enable insect detection as well. If you're wanting to put it in drone detection, you need to put it on airplane, and that will automatically enable drone detection in addition to airplanes. So with the camera now in insect detection, I went out and tried to shoot some insects. And basically, in the time I had, I settled with some bees. Overall, it was just okay. When the bee had stopped at a flower and was motionless, and I tapped the screen to autofocus, the camera, locked in, and if I moved the camera like this, it stayed locked on. The problem came when the bee took off. It took off and the camera just didn't follow it. It was just that simple. There was one case where it did come through. Let me show you. So I was focused on this bee right here. You see that? And I had tapped the screen and I had a green square right on him. And I was holding the camera. I had the camera in burst mode and I was ready. And within seconds, the bee just took off. And before I could even think, I was like, pressing the shutter release button. The camera followed the bee and was able to get a shot like this. I probably could not have gotten that shot, or at least not as easily, if the camera didn't have that insect subject detection feature. But maybe I just got lucky. I don't know. What I do know is that it was just okay. I wasn't that impressed with, insect auto detect. I did not test drone auto detect. I didn't think there'd be a big demand for it from my audience. However, if all of you want me to test drone auto detect, I happen to have a few drones, I will fly them up in the sky and detect them all day and report back to you. Just let me know. So what has all this unscientific testing shown us? Well, I have to say that with the firmware update, the X-T5 is definitely better with face-eye auto detect and subject detection than it was before the firmware update. It's a noticeable difference, particularly with subjects moving quickly toward the camera. I did also conduct a bunch of tracking tests as well, but again, I didn't get into it that much. I do think that face-eye auto detect is sort of the winner here. It seems to me to be the standout of this firmware firmware update. Now, the subject detection regarding birds was okay. I didn't notice a massive difference, but what I did notice was that it seemed to me to be smarter detecting subjects in the foreground and ignoring the background, or detecting subjects in the background if I had tapped on them and highlighted them green using the touchscreen. It seemed to do better at that than it did before I performed the firmware update. The other issue that I think Fuji has resolved, or at least made a lot better, was that issue that I did bring up in my X-T5 review video from before. And if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. I go over everything with this camera. But in that video, I mentioned specifically that the camera seemed to have some kind of an issue where it would show that the subject was in focus, right? If, let's say I put it in Face Eye Autodetect, it would have green, 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 green. Everything would look great. Green, green, green. And then I would bring the images into Lightroom or Capture One, and it would be like focus, focus, blur, blur, focus, blur, 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 like that. And I would be like, wait a minute, I thought that was green at the time I took the shot. So I did bring that up, and what I did notice is that seems to have been fixed or greatly reduced. When I shot Face Eye Autodetect, for the most part, when you saw green in the camera, you got green in editing and post-production. Is now the autofocus on the X-T5 as good as the XS20? And to that, I would have to say, not quite. It's great, okay? To be clear, but the XS20 has one feature that the X-T5 doesn't have, and that is the auto feature from the PASM dial. On the XS20, when you put the PASM dial in auto, the camera literally took over. And in some cases, the camera took over too much, but in many cases, it did an incredible job. That was something that impressed me even more than the firmware update autofocus on the X-T5. And maybe that was just a one-off thing for me because I did not have the XS20 to test it all that much. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, go see the review I made on the XS20 camera, and I go right into and explain everything about that autofocus setting and how the camera handles the scenes. The bottom line here is that the firmware update 2.0 is free. You may as well put it on your camera and try it out, and I encourage you to do so. Well, thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you found the video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, be sure to give it the like and subscribe. I am going to be signing off now, but have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you in a brand new video next week. Take care.